Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our latest IFLA ENSULIB webinar series, Sustainability in Libraries, Buildings, Operations, and Partnerships with Users. My name is Curtis Flood. I'm going to be overseeing this morning's webinar, and I am coming to you live from Fisher Library at the University of Sydney. So thank you for attending and welcome, everyone. Before we get started, I just want to quickly remind everyone that we have enabled the closed captions function. So if you require closed captions, just select the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I think we're ready to go. Our numbers are looking pretty good. So I'm now going to pass over to get things underway to Priscilla Pun. So Priscilla, it's over to you.
Thank you, Kurt. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're good to go, Priscilla. You're good to go.
Okay, good. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the IFLA ENSULIB webinar series. It's the number 8 webinar in the series held by the IFLA's Environment, Sustainability, and Libraries section. My name is Priscilla Poon from the University of Macau Library. I'm the information coordinator of the ENSULIB section. Please feel free to type your name and country into the chat. We are interested in knowing where you are. Starting from January 2022, ENSULIB hosts its webinars irregularly on the topics related to the green and sustainable libraries and library projects, the UN SDGs, and the relevant emerging trends, with the aim to encourage librarians to inspire their communities into a more environmental and sustainable way of action and practices. Today, we have the number 8 webinar presented to you. The title of the webinar today is Sustainability in Libraries, Buildings, Operations, and Partnerships with Users. Before we begin, let me start with some notes on privacy and administration. Next slide, please. This event is being recorded, including chat. The video will be posted on YouTube, and the link of the video will be on the ENSULIB's webpage as well as social media. Microphones have been muted for this event. If you have any questions or comments, please type into the Q&A box. And next, Antonia Madata, the standing member of ENSULIB, will introduce the webinar and the speaker. Antonia, please.
Thank you, Priscilla, and hello, everybody. My name is Antonia, and I'm the Director of Central Services at the University of Sydney Library. In today's session, our esteemed presenter, Benjamin Meunier, responds to the questions: can libraries afford to wait for others to fix the world while toxic waste, climate change, and pollution harm our environment? How much of a difference can we make anyway? This session aims to raise ambitions for greener library buildings, provide examples of how library services can lead by example as sustainably managed organisations, and highlight the opportunities to work in partnership with users and move towards a smarter, sustainable world. Next slide, please. I'd like to introduce our presenter, Benjamin Meunier, who is the University Librarian at the Chinese University of Hong Kong since April 2023. As University Librarian, Benjamin is responsible for overseeing CUHK's library operations with effective strategic planning and supervision, enhancing the student learning experience in accordance with the university's teaching initiatives, developing key collaborative relationships with major stakeholders, strengthening collections of the library for the key research areas of the university, and building comprehensive collections across the disciplines. Previously, he was the Director of Operations at University College London Library, Culture, Collections and Open Science, overseeing estate developments, health and safety, communication and other operational matters. He was the strategic lead for sustainable estate developments across 16 sites and chaired the Departmental Sustainability Committee. Please join me in welcoming Benjamin, and Benjamin, over to you. Next slide, please.
Thank you very much, Tonia, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this session. Thank you very much for joining. Hello to colleagues from CUHK, from Hong Kong, New Zealand, the US, and Australia. It's great to see such a wide representation of participants in the session today. So as promised, I'll be talking about sustainability in libraries. I want to thank the Environment, Sustainability and Library section of IFLA for inviting me to give this talk. And let me just start by telling you a little about what I'll be talking about. Next slide, please. So I'll be starting off with a bit of scene setting and the wider context within this conversation is happening. I'll talk about the 3 areas that are outlined in the program in terms of where I feel that libraries can make a difference and make an impact. The first is around buildings and raising the ambition for green buildings and being smart about sustainability. The second area is around operations and as responsible institutions leading by example and showing organizations how we can be sustainable in the way that we do our day-to-day business. And then I'll talk about partnership and how that can enable us to ask the right questions about the way forward and allow us to move forwards together as a community of library staff and users in different types of contexts. And then I'll wrap up with some concluding remarks. So hopefully this is what you signed up for. Let's move straight to my introductory remarks. So next slide, please. When we think about sustainability, sustainability can sound quite positive and forward-looking, but one of the challenges I think that we're facing right now is around tackling toxification, tackling the way that the world that we live in is becoming less prone to be less conducive for human existence, less conducive for living things, whether they are animal or vegetation. And actually, it's not only about sustaining what we're currently doing, it's about reversing and radically changing some of the approaches that we've taken so far. This cartoon indicates some of the more horrendous prospects of the kind of worlds that we might be moving towards, but also suggesting that younger generations and responsible people might be able to help us to make sure we remain on a livable Earth. One of the analogies which I feel is relevant in this context is around performance of athletes. We know the biology of life. We know that oxygen is essential for most living creatures, and we know how to generate that and encourage it. For elite athletes, there's an emphasis on clean living and making sure that they have the right conditions for optimal performance. So we know these things scientifically, but overconsumption, reliance on fossil fuels, petrol, reliance on plastics, and the generation of pollution and overconsumption more generally are all the equivalent of taking the elite athlete I was referring to and them going on a training program of eating junk food and sitting down watching TV. So we know what that will lead to, and it won't be top performance. It will be poor health outcomes, it'll be demotivation. And that is the direction of travel that without significant action, we're traveling towards. Our Vice Chancellor last week, Professor Rocky Twan, was talking at the Asia University Summit about his perception of the sustainability challenge. He described that the world isn't inherited from our ancestors, that the world is in fact borrowed from our children and our grandchildren and future generations. So when we think about framing the challenges in that way, there is an immediate challenge for us to think about how do we make sure that our children, grandchildren, future generations don't inherit the kind of world that is portrayed on the right-hand side of the cartoon. So collectively, as knowledge organizations, we have a responsibility to help with education and new ways of behaving so that our values of libraries around care, around respect for the environment, around learning about the environment that we live in are all shared with the wider society. And that really is the starting point for this presentation about how we as libraries can play our role in avoiding the less optimistic scenarios that are outlined, and actually knowing that we have agency, that we are able to make a difference. So that's the starting point. Next slide, please. So I'll be talking initially about buildings, because buildings do have a significant footprint, and they shape a lot of how we perceive the world. And the way I want to frame this conversation about the built environment is about not only building good buildings for libraries, but also raising the ambition of what is possible within the world of the built environment, and thinking more boldly about the types of green buildings that can be created. Next slide, please. So there's a famous quote, which most of you are probably familiar with, that the most sustainable building is the one that is already built. This is architect Carl Elefante, and it's important to not always assume that green buildings are something for the future. Through the amount of resource and effort that's gone into creating current buildings, if we knock them down and build something new, we are releasing a large amount of carbon that's already built in. We're generating a lot of waste that may not be necessary. And I want to take a couple of examples of reuse of existing buildings and talk about those. So one which I have intimate experience with is the Cruciform building at University College London. The Cruciform building, which is pictured on the left, in the top left, used to be the University College Hospital when it was first built in the early 20th century. In the 1990s, it was converted from a hospital building into a teaching and research building for University College London. The hospital moved to another site on the other side of the road, and this building was released and converted. As you can see, it's a beautiful building, almost like a Disneyland fairy tale castle type of construction. And one of the interesting features, as the name suggests, it is in the shape of a cross. And the way it was designed in the Victorian era reflected thinking at the time that by keeping the most infectious patients away from the main circulation routes at the center, you would avoid cross infection. And so the way that the building was structured had the wings for treatment and the wards on the periphery of the building, and the central core of the building was the main circulation route. In the basement of the Cruciform building was the pharmacy. And when the building was converted and changed into a research and teaching building, the medical library took the place of the pharmacy from the hospital. This is a beautiful gem of a building. It's a grade 2 listed building in the center of London. And there was an incredible opportunity to refurbish what was a tired library in around 2012, refurbish a tired library into a new kind of learning space for the medical faculty. And if we can go to the next slide, I'll share with you some of the features that we incorporated. So over the course of time, the windows of the lower ground floor where the pharmacy used to be were bricked up because it was cheaper to maintain by having bricked up windows rather than lots of glass to clean and maintain. So we reinstated a large number of windows and created quite light spaces, bearing in mind that this is subterranean, this is just under the road level. We created a lot of light spaces, also inserted a couple of roof lights to provide light and open space for students to use with many computers, space that's open 24 hours, and a range of social and individual learning spaces. You can also see on the bottom image that we incorporated a large number of collaborative workspaces And at the back of that picture, there is a glass case, which was used to insert a number of pathology specimens, bits of humans that were dissected out over the early 20th century and held in formal and different concoctions, so that it gives a real medical identity to that space. Talking of the medical identity and the history of the building, we also use the fact that it is a quirky shape. We use the fact that it has a lot of awkward corners and angles to actually make that a feature of the building. So you can see the slightly triangular shaped project workspaces are actually utilizing the fact that the building is an awkward shape, and we didn't knock down the structure to create a nice rectangular shape. We actually use those different quirks to make the spaces feel special and feel unique and individual. In terms of sustainability features, the Cruciform Hub project achieved the SCAR gold rating. SCAR is an environmental accreditation scheme which recognizes sustainability of buildings, and that was the gold rating was in recognition of the fact that 99% of all the waste generated from the project was diverted from landfill. 100% of the timber that was used in the project in terms of sourcing was responsibly sourced from forests that were accredited by the Forestry Commission in the UK. All the carpets, which can be hard to recycle in terms of standard industrial type carpets, all the carpets were procured so that they could be recycled at the end of their lives. And we put in place a number of measures to minimize energy utilization. Bearing in mind this is a 24-hour building. LED lighting was put throughout, occupancy sensors so that the areas could be closed off at times when the library was closer, and sub-meters for the checking of energy consumption so that we could tell which areas could be closed off and minimize the energy utilization of the building. So all of these elements contributed towards sustainability accreditation. It was very well received by students, both in terms of the types of spaces, but also the sustainability credentials. I think a lot of young people who are coming into our libraries, whether they're academic libraries or public libraries, are expecting us to be contributing towards that positive change in the environment. And that is a feature which our students were particularly proud of at UCL. So that's one example. And as I say, it's a very fine building to work with. Go to the next slide. We'll move on to a slightly more challenging context. So this is Luxembourg in the center of Western Europe, tucked away between France, Belgium, and Germany. And in Luxembourg, a lot of the legacy industry is from steel production. Very rich area in terms of raw minerals, and that obviously leaves a trace on the landscape. So this is the old steelworks from the Belval Steelworks Hill, and the government of Luxembourg in the early 2000s considered what it could use the space for and decided to move the University of Luxembourg and expand the University of Luxembourg onto this site. So whereas the Cruciform building in the center of London had a very distinct fairy tale quality, this is very much at the other end in terms of industrial heritage. Instead of dismantling all of this industrial history, what the university and the developers decided to do was to architecturally incorporate this into the building. And that has led to a stunning library building, which opened in 2018-19. And if we can go on to the next image, let me show you what the spaces look like. So here you can see in the image in the center of the screen, the way that the ovens and the skips that were used in the production of steel in their heyday are now architectural features that anchor the library in the space. The library, the Luxembourg Learning Center, incorporates a wide range of quiet study spaces, group study spaces, with the incorporation of spots of color in the learning spaces against a background of grey that matches the industrial feel of the site. And it has this wonderful effect of clouds of learning floating above the industrial features and elements. And it's a very beautiful and inspiring space. And the role of our libraries is very much to uplift the minds of our users, enable them to reach higher in terms of their learning journeys. And this certainly does have that feature of inspiring users through reuse of an estate that you would not think was ideal for creating a library, for building a library around. So this is a very impressive facility. It was the host of the LIBA Architecture Group seminar last year, and has received rave reviews in terms of the quality of space and also the sustainable approach to construction. The way that the building is built utilizes natural light to maximize the natural lighting in the space. And you can see in the image in the center how triangular shading effects were used to minimize solar gain within the space. So it's a building I would highly recommend if anyone is going to the IFLA conference in Rotterdam and you have some spare time to explore the Luxembourg Learning Center. And so if we could move to the next slide, please. I want to talk about some of the raising of ambition and the opportunities that can be built within library buildings. This is looking at another project which I was closely involved in, the UCL Student Center, which opened in 2019. You can see a quote by the project sponsor at the bottom of the screen, which highlighted the level of pride institutionally that was generated by the building, and particularly its sustainability credentials. And it was the recipient of a sustainability outstanding award from BREEAM. I'll talk briefly about the elements of the approach here that contributed towards that BREEAM outstanding achievement. The first was a passive first approach, whereby the way that the building is ventilated and cooled relies in the first instance on natural phenomena. So there's a large atrium which allows the flow of air through the building. And the construction, as you can see from the images, both images in fact, is very reliant on bare concrete, and the concrete provides a thermal mass, which means that the building doesn't heat up excessively. The concrete absorbs a lot of the heat generated during the hotter months, and it releases that heat during the colder months so that it doesn't rely on a large amount of active heating or cooling of the building. Where the building does require heating or cooling, there are two boreholes that go 400, that go underground and provide the hot and cold water by using geothermal effects, provide hot and cold water to heat or cool the fabric of the building. And that is so effective that in the summer of 2019, when it was particularly hot in the UK, the building was one of the most comfortable in the campus, despite the fact that a number of buildings did have air conditioning. The way that this was designed as a whole meant that it provided a very relaxed and cool atmosphere to be in. The building also incorporates 400 square meters of photovoltaic panels so that the generation of electricity can be done via the sun's energy rather than using fossil fuels. And the way that water is used in the building means that it's 55% more efficient than other buildings on the campus because of efficient sanitary fittings and reuse of grey water from rainwater and so on can be reused for toilets and circulation of water in the building. Finally, the student centre uses highly durable materials like this bare concrete, so there's not a need for a lot of maintenance or replacement of soft fittings, and the furniture and fittings and equipment in the building were all selected on the basis of their resilience and durability rather than aesthetics and cost alone. One of the final highlights from the construction process of the student centre that I want to note is that the project board was devoted almost religiously to ensuring that the building achieved the highest possible environmental credentials that it could. You can have 4 ratings in the BREEAM scheme. Outstanding is the top. You can have BREEAM excellent, and there was a point where projects could have been in either outstanding or excellent, and the project board worked extremely hard to make sure that decisions were not made purely on the decision on the basis of cost of the construction, but that any changes were considered in light of both cost impacts and environmental impacts. And those 2 factors were important. And I think in terms of general practice in construction management and oversight, that was one of the features that enabled the building to be so effective and efficient environmentally, because the way that it was designed really focused on environmental sustainability as a key feature. And as I say, you can see the quote from Professor Anthony Smith, who chaired the project board, at the bottom, which describes the outcome. To wrap up on the built environment side, something which I'd like to note is that a lot of the features that make buildings sustainable are not only good for the environment, but when we're talking about more natural light, like I described in the cruciform hub, when we're talking about natural ventilation, as we have in the student centre, the incorporation of shading, planting and vegetation within buildings, all of these are good for human users of the buildings. So when we're talking about sustainability, I think it's worth stressing that we're not only talking about benefits to future generations that are yet to come, we're also making sure that our experience of libraries, our users' experience of libraries, is as good as it can be, and is uplifting people and is contributing towards better better lives, better health in the present. So it's not only an investment in the future, but also improvements in the short term for our current generations of users and staff. Let's move on to operations. So if we could go to the next slide, please. I mentioned here, one of the aspirations is to lead by example. For our institutions, like our universities or our libraries in different sectors, to be exemplars for good practice in sustainability. So if we could go to the next slide, please, I'll talk a little about operations. So this is based on current experience at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the work that's happening in CUHK Library specifically, which is based on work that my colleagues Lily Ko, who I saw is on the call today, and Leo Ma, who are also part of the CUHK Library, pulled together in terms of the work that's happening here at CUHK Library to impact on the Sustainable Development Goals that the UN has set. In particular, the way that the library is making a difference relates to the 5 goals on the screen. I won't read them all right now because I'll be going through those very shortly. But you can see that when we as libraries look at how we can make a difference to sustainability, there is a wide range of areas where it aligns very closely with our day jobs, our daily operations, the nature of what we do. And so let me just explore those a little. Let's move on to the next slide, please. One of the areas that libraries in our operations can make a difference is by firstly setting our objectives in relation to wider sustainability agendas. So when we look at the SDG 13 on climate action and look at what we do, in the current CUHK Library strategic plan, there is a line about ensuring that we make carbon neutrality a priority. If you could go to the next slide, please, it will highlight in our current strategic plan that we want to support the university to achieve its goal of carbon neutrality by 2038. And that is setting an ambition, it's setting a goal which everyone can get behind. And I think it's important when we're defining our objectives that we're not only looking at the quality of information that we're collecting and making accessible, that we're not only looking at the quality of the learning environments that we're providing and study environments, not only looking at open science agendas and looking at future ways of exchanging knowledge, but also looking at practical ways that we can make a difference. So I was delighted to see that this is already part of the strategic plan and very much part of the lived experience of colleagues here in CUHK Library. And next slide, please. Another way of tackling climate change for us in our libraries is to make sure that we collect data, or that we ask our colleagues in estates departments, in building management teams to provide us with the data so that we can monitor our performance and identify priorities for improvement. This is a snapshot from the CUHK energy consumption chart, and it tracks over time based on a month basis, on a building by building basis, how much energy is used. That is critical. If we want to be able to make informed decisions, we need to have the underlying data to enable us to make those decisions. And so I think for libraries across the different sectors that we operate in, this is an important founding block to enable us to take action. And again, it's something which can then be used in discussions by committees or by individuals to look at how do we move downwards and dial our own carbon impact down by drilling down on the data. Next slide, please. And finally, in terms of climate action, many of our libraries have got great pull power to draw in experts who know about this area from a scientific basis and from a popularization of science. So in terms of tackling climate illiteracy, in terms of tackling the misinformation that circulates, libraries have got the ability, and I would argue the responsibility, to ensure that we share knowledge in this space. And the Research Cafe, which is a regular program run by CUHK Library, has had as a theme for a number of sessions, carbon neutrality, bringing in academics, students, and other participants into these sessions, facilitated by the library. And I think that's a really good example of how to help to share awareness and suggestions about tackling climate action. So these are three areas where libraries can play a part in informing and addressing climate change. Next slide, please. Another sustainable development goal relates to good health and well-being. And I touched on this in terms of how our built environment can improve good health and well-being. In our activities and events, we can also make a number of impacts in this space. So at CUHK, we have, during the exam revision period, when students are very stressed and time poor and spending a lot of time in the library, we host Dr. Dog, which is a pet, a real dog or a number of dogs who can come into the library, and students can interact with the animal, and they can be, and students benefit from that. We also consider animal welfare, obviously, so that the dog doesn't get stressed by relieving the stress of humans, and there is a balancing act there, but it is a kind of activity which can help to reconnect students with priorities in life, and realize that exams are one thing, but actually taking care of yourself is also important, and interacting with other living creatures can be a way of helping students to reconnect with that element of themselves. The library also hosts meditation events, and we provide a number of resources around self-care, well-being. So I've got a snapshot here of the library guide, the LIB guide on positive psychology, which is provided by the library in partnership with our colleagues in the university that help with student well-being. All of these resources contribute towards sustainability in the sense that they contribute towards realization that we as humans need to take care of ourselves and of our environment. So that's a range of activities which many of our libraries already undertake, but I wanted to share an example from the CUHK library because I was struck by the range of activities that happen here and how well received they are by our users. Next slide, please. So SDG 4 is quality education. We are in the business of education, I think, in all of our libraries, whether that is education of young people, education of students in further education or higher education, education of professionals in some of our corporate library sectors. And in quality education, the list is almost endless of the kinds of activities that we could undertake to support our users to behave in ways that align with this sustainable development goal. 3 examples that I've adopted here are around information literacy and encouraging greater levels of information literacy amongst our users. CUHK and partners in Hong Kong launched InfoLit for You, which I won't have time to play you even a short clip of, but this is a MOOC, and it allows participants to obtain some understanding and some tips about good practice in information literacy. We also have a series of seminars and webinars around a range of topics, including academic integrity, so enabling students to have that self-discipline and making sure that they are compliant with good practice in academic writing. And then finally, in terms of supporting quality education, the library also very actively promotes different types of titles that students might not be exposed to in their day-to-day lives or in their particular discipline. And so we have Goodreads corners in some of our sites, which encourage students to explore different areas of literature that they might not have otherwise encountered. And I think we talk a bit about the loss of serendipity through the move towards digital resources rather than physical resources. And one of the ways that libraries can try and provoke that serendipity is by putting material in front of our users' noses and encourage them to think about things they might not have otherwise considered. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to move on. Next slide, please. So the third and final area, which I want to talk on, is around partnerships and how libraries can work with our users and our stakeholders to make a difference towards sustainability in the broadest sense. On the left, you can see an image of our university library and the very prominent objective from the university to achieve carbon neutrality by 2038. And a lot of work is underway by our sustainable development team in partnership with the library and other departments to try and achieve that objective. So let's start on partnerships. Next slide, please. One of the key areas in partnerships I've alluded to in operations relates to how we foster a better, healthier environment, which then contributes towards human well-being. So many of our staff, and in fact, many of our users in libraries, and I think this is generalizing, but it's also true, have an inclination and a passion for caring for the environment in the wider sense. As libraries, we tend to have a long view about the nature of what we do. Many libraries have been around for a long time, and I think all of us expect to be around for a number of centuries at least. And so taking that long view tends to also raise up the level of realization that we need to care for our environment as well as our information resources. Ways that I have seen libraries action this appetite, this interest in taking care of the environment, is through indoor plants, whether that's in staff offices, in user areas, and getting staff or users. And in UCL, we had a team of volunteer students who would help to water the plants in the student centre on all the floors, dotted around the 1,000 study spaces in the building. We can also help to incorporate in our built environment more roof terraces and green spaces in gardens, and make sure that we bring in nature where we can and where it's not going to impact on our physical holdings in particular. And at CUHK Library, we have on the roof, just to my right, I can look down on the library farm, which is a rooftop allotment where library staff can go at the end of the day and farm their whatever plants they choose to, vegetables. In fact, I was presented from a very kind colleague with a bag of cherry tomatoes from the library farm last month, which were a delicious addition to my dinner that day. So there are ways that we can harness the enthusiasm of our library colleagues and our users to help to take care of more parcels of nature. I think we are finite in terms of the time that we have and the numbers that we are, but we can all contribute in that area and make a difference collectively around the world. Next slide, please. And in terms of drawing on the talents and the enthusiasm of our communities, I would suggest that hosting grassroots events like the Research Cafe I alluded to earlier can help not necessarily to find the solutions to fossil fuel generation, to how do we reduce the carbon footprint of air travel or of travel generally, but it can help us to find some new questions, some new ways of framing the challenges, and over time to find those solutions collectively, rather than assuming that someone in a bureau somewhere will come up with the answer, or laboratory will come up with the answer that will flick a switch and we'll be fine with climate change, with the generation of waste, of plastic toxicity in the oceans, etc. So having that engagement can help with senior managers in organizations to raise those matters to others and to engage with designers and engineers and people from all walks of life, so that we're not necessarily just looking for the answers, but also looking at how we can address the short-term challenges that we're facing in a local way, rather than just trying to answer the big questions. And one of the really effective tools that I've found, or mechanisms that I've found works well, is looking to our users, looking to our young people, like students in the UK. There is a scheme that's been running for over 10 years now called Green Impact, which is a partnership between the Students' Union and the National Union of Students, rather, so students' unions around universities and universities. And Green Impact enables student auditors to be trained every year and to go around willing departments, volunteer departments, to ask them questions about how are you performing in sustainability areas. And that helps to drive improvement incrementally year on year. And the library at UCL, I was incredibly proud of, was the highest contributor towards Green Impact in terms of teams that were entering, and we routinely obtained gold. I think they ran out of awards colours to give us, so they invented platinum awards for library teams. I think it's an area where we can work in partnership with our users to monitor what we're doing and improve what we're doing, and get some recognition for that, because when we measure something, we then suddenly seem to value it more greatly. And so having structured schemes that count how you're doing in sustainability will then help to make that more visible and better valued by others. So let me now move to my final slide and concluding remarks. Next slide, please. The key points I want to highlight is that whilst we do have library buildings and we can make a difference, our real strengths are around our convening power, that libraries can bring people together. The nature of what we do is knowledge exchange, and we can bring people together with expertise to share knowledge and experience and tackle environmental issues by drawing on the enthusiasm of our communities. I want to also stress that this isn't someone else's problem to fix in time, that we as libraries have agency. We can do a lot of the things that I've presented. It is happening. There's a lot of good practice in the sector, and hopefully some of these ideas you might be able to implement in your areas. And finally, that if we each make a small difference in our part of the world, in our part of the institution that we're in, that collective power can lead and will lead to big change, but we do need to take that responsibility upon ourselves to effect that change. So I want to thank you all for your attention, to reiterate my thanks to all of the colleagues who've helped contribute to this, both in terms of the projects I mentioned I was involved in, and my colleagues at UHK who've done all of the work that I've been celebrating in the section on operations and on partnerships. And I will conclude and open up for questions now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. That was an absolutely fascinating presentation and so many practical and excellent examples of how libraries can become more sustainable, both in terms of library buildings and also services and initiatives. So thank you for sharing your vast experience with us. We do have some time now for Q&A. Will, could we go back to the slides, please, and just advance a couple of slides? I'd like to introduce our colleague, Vivian, who's here presenting the Q&A with me as well. So next slide, I think go 2 forward. And again, and again. Thank you very much. Oh, back 1. Vivian Bird and I are going to field the questions that have come in through the Q&A. We do have a couple of questions that have come through to get us started, but please do take this opportunity to enter any questions you may have for Benjamin using the Q&A function in Zoom. And just to begin with, Benjamin, if I could ask you the first question, then I'll hand to Vivian. Many library building projects tend to be smaller scale refurbishments rather than large new buildings. Are there any measures that can be taken to make libraries more sustainable on those kinds of projects?
Thank you, Antonia. So I would say, drawing on the example of the Cruciform Hub that I started with, there are some environmental schemes at a national level that can be used to monitor, that are tailored to smaller projects. So that the SCAR scheme is specifically for smaller scale projects, whereas there are some other schemes like BREEAM that are tailored, that are geared up towards larger buildings. So there are ways of measuring, of adopting that, what are we valuing in that construction process, which exist. And I would say on a practical basis, for the smaller scale projects, it is the usual triad of reduce, reuse, recycle. So not necessarily to discard everything that we're starting with as the starting point for refurbishment on a smaller scale, of thinking about how could we minimize the level of waste and disruption that we're generating and deliver the goals that we've set ourselves on the project. So I think for reducing, that's important. For reuse, it's worth remembering that we are not we don't exist in isolation, and that many library partners in possibly the same sector as us or in different sectors may well be interested. So I remember in some projects at UCL where we were converting spaces with large numbers of metal shelving to be more open, quiet, more open learning spaces. There was no use for us to reuse the shelving, and we offered it up internally within the university. There was no take up. However, a charity was just setting up a new warehouse to distribute books internationally, and they were very happy to obtain some free shelving so that we could actually reuse what we had, but not for our own selves. So I think that's important. And then just remembering the waste streams and trying to minimize the amount of waste that we as libraries are sending to landfill. All of those factors can help us on our smaller projects to be sustainable.
Thank you. And I'm going to move on to the second question. How do you measure the sustainability of your library to understand whether or not you are making a difference for the environment?
Vivian, so on that question, I would say at CUHK Library, first thing I would say, I'm still learning, so I don't yet know the whole range of what we're doing, but I illustrated the energy consumption metrics that we obtain from our estates management office colleagues. And that is one very tangible way that you can see how much energy you're consuming and by extension, the carbon footprint that you're producing. The most effective tool I have found so far is schemes like Green Impact, schemes where we invite our students, or indeed it could be any auditor, but it's helpful to have it internally and less formalized, to have a group of people who are critical friends to come in and tell you these are the areas that you could improve on. I suspect there is some really good practice that people will be willing to share, and this may be something that IFLA ENSULIB might work with the buildings and equipment section to provide some a toolkit, a set of metrics for basic, doing the right thing on a very basic level, and then some incremental steps that one might take once you've done the basics to challenge oneself to go further forwards. Because I feel like one of the key strengths that we have as a sector is the willingness to share knowledge. We're not competing to kind of save the world in our specific area. This is an area where we can all collaborate, indeed, not only between libraries, but also with other sectors. So that would be my answer to that one. Thank you, Vivian.
Thank you.
Thanks, Benjamin. There's another question here for you. Are there any distinctive characteristics that make libraries particularly relevant to improving sustainability in our communities and societies?
Thanks, Antonia. So on this one, distinctive characteristics of our libraries, I touched on the long game that libraries are in, that we are not in the world to make a profit and get out of it at the end of it, that we are here to curate and maintain collections for posterity. And I think that is culturally, and in terms of our values, a unique characteristic that aligns very well with long-term sustainability goals that we are thinking about, the kind of world that we will pass on to future generations. I think that that's an important starting point around values of libraries that relate to sustainability. I think another distinctive characteristic from libraries that helps, that frames this discussion, is that we are still one of the trusted institutions in society in a world where trust in information has very much been eroded over the last few decades. So taking that responsibility, taking that characteristic and using it in a responsible manner to help to educate our users is another area. And I touched on openness. I think openness is a really important part of the relevance of libraries for communities and society in terms of sustainability, because we can share information. People may wish away or ignore data that we can share about about the environment, about pollution, about climate change, but we can provide that for what it is, saying this is what peer-reviewed researchers are saying, and bring people together to hear it out, and then to have a discussion. If people disagree, then that's fine, but it's important to be able to have that dialogue, so that people who have alternative views can share their evidence, the supporting data for that, and then that can help to further understanding. So I think that those are the three key areas I would highlight in terms of distinctive characteristics of libraries.
Thanks so much, Ben. Over to you, Vivian.
Thank you. And we have one more question from a participant. When measuring sustainability, aiming at decrease in the carbon footprint of libraries, do you aim for an end of world scenario, which is zero carbon footprint, or a percentage reduction that meets current agreed level of sustainability?
Thanks, Vivian. End of world scenario. So I guess zero carbon footprint is when the world is no longer. I think that there will always be a carbon footprint to humans, because when we breathe, we produce carbon. That's just what we're doing. So I think there is no zero carbon footprint. Zero carbon footprint. If zero carbon footprint means that we balance the carbon that we produce with an environment that is able to absorb it, and that we take responsibility for making sure that the environment that we operate in can absorb all the carbon that we're generating, then yes, that is the ultimate goal. But that is maybe the goal for the world in 50 years' time. So as COP has been doing, I think it's important to set some incremental goals, and for us in our libraries to be setting some realistic, achievable goals that we can contribute to. And again, many of us are part of larger organizations. So at CUHK, our objective for the university is to be zero carbon by 2038. That's a long time. It's certainly a longer time window than a number of UK universities, but the context is different. So we should be adapting our objectives to the environment we exist in, but we should also, I would suggest, we should also be challenging the objectives if we don't feel that they're stretching enough, and actually try and drive that change forward, so that we're not only the implementers of decisions that are made from on high, we can also engage with stakeholders, both grassroots activists and with senior stakeholders, to try and marry up the differences. And if our users are telling us this is a crisis, we need to make change now, then we should probably convey that in a structured way to decision makers, so that we can maybe be even more ambitious than we currently are. I think that's the key, is incrementally setting smart objectives, and not just saying we need to change everything right now. We need to have some realistic goals of how we make the change happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin, for your considered and insightful answers to the questions that we've had. I think that just about brings us to the end of the session. If we could just go to the next slide, please, Will. Just a few words that I'd like to mention. Firstly, thank you to Benjamin and our panelists for joining us today, and particularly to Ben for the insights that you've shared. We've really appreciated hearing from you. Just like to remind everybody that ENSULIB does offer a webinar series, and our next upcoming events are on the IFLA events page, so please do keep an eye out for future webinars. And of course, there may be several of you in the call today, in the webinar today, who will be attending the IFLA World Congress in Rotterdam in August, and we really look forward to seeing you there. Do come and visit the various ENSULIB sessions that will be held, but in particular the Green Library Awards, which are our main event for the World Congress. So we do hope to see you there. And thanks once again, Ben, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.